noticed that fantasy has a lot of speculative supernatural elements. Stuff like magic of all kinds, supernatural characters like elves and gods, and any kind of speculation on all kinds of supernatural things. As a Christian myself, the speculation about the supernatural, especially the supernatural outside of God, is something that I'm not comfortable with in most cases. I think there's a place for knowing what life without God's love is like, and I tend to see these stories glorify the supernatural outside of God rather than simply explaining it. They tend to glorify paganism, mythology, and witchcraft, and any kind of anti-God spirituality. The thing is, I really like some of the elements of fantasy. Not necessarily the spiritual speculation stuff, but I like the aesthetic, I like the outfits, I like the creativity, the world-building design, the kingdom elements, the moral lessons, the potential idealism. In my opinion, some stories just don't make a lot of sense unless they're told in some kind of a fantasy setting. But I find that nearly all fantasy is based on some kind of world-building magic. It's really hard for me as a Christian to try enjoying or getting immersed into these kinds of stories. Like, say there's a story where there's a fantasy land where there's two rival kingdoms, and the main character needs to bring peace through some kind of skill or friendship or righteousness. But in many stories like this, right when it's about to get good, the main character needs to go on some kind of spiritual quest into the spirit realm to balance the elemental spirits and powers. Or maybe he has to recruit or defeat some kind of demonic monster. Or he has to gather a group of friends, but some of them are supernatural type of friends, maybe elves or spiritual beings. Or he has to go through mage training or go to wizard school. The plot usually sets it up so that he has to do these things or encounter speculative supernatural before he can save his world. This pretty much happens every time I look into a fantasy story. There are rare exceptions. Sometimes in certain historical stories or international stories, there will be sort of a historical fiction vibe where it's technically fantasy, but it has a lot less magic and speculation compared to normal fantasy. But most of the time, fantasy is full of speculative supernatural. I can't be the only one who is bothered by the glorification of usually anti-God speculation of the supernatural in fantasy. I can't be the only one who faces this same issue when I go to watch a movie or read a book. Let me know in the comments if you're a Christian who's also bothered by this. See, in my opinion, even most classic Christian fantasy is full of mythology and pagan themes. I made a whole video on this channel if you'd like to check that out. But at the end of the day, I would prefer Christian fantasy, but I can't even find regular old non-Christian fantasy that isn't usually speculative supernatural fiction. I wouldn't mind watching a non-Christian story or reading a non-Christian book as long as it's clean. It's just that both Christian and non-Christian stories usually have the same problems in this genre. But in my opinion, these stories don't always need magic, mythology, and paganism to have a compelling plot. They just end up having it. It's just how fantasy usually is. Now you might be telling me, well, if you can't handle the speculative supernatural in fantasy, then just go read sci-fi and historical fiction. Go read other fiction, maybe realistic fiction or real life. Just don't read fantasy. Well, here's my problem with sci-fi in general and then historical fiction in general. To start with historical fiction, many times it is based on real history events, and it's bound to history. It's bound to the events and cultures and peoples of times past. Now, science fiction can be interesting, but its aesthetic is not something I'm always a fan of. Many times it can be dull, and it can have gray and bland cityscapes and concrete structures and aesthetics that are just not as vibrant, bright, and dynamic as other types of storytelling. Sometimes it also limits itself to technology. Just as historical fiction is limited to what history had in the past, science fiction can limit itself to technology, to artificial intelligence, to robots, to anything mechanical and technological. I would rather personally not have most of my bad guys or antagonists or even good guys and protagonists be based on robots, artificial intelligence, and machines. Now, not every sci-fi story has this, but a lot of them do. I just don't always want stories that are about futurism and technology, and even speculation of the future and technology. Another problem with science fiction, and sometimes even historical fan fiction, is that it sometimes ends up just being a repackaging of magic, paganism, and mythology, but it's just science coded now. So it might have energy that might not be explainable by science, basically magic energy, but it's being harnessed by the technology or main characters are using it. Again, historical fiction can sometimes have this as well. But this stuff is clearly magic wearing a cloak of scientific terms in science fiction stories. Many aliens in sci-fi are genuinely just repackaged magical and mythological and pagan creatures. Just because supernatural speculation is packaged in science talk doesn't mean I'm comfortable with it. At the end of the day, the supernatural speculation found in science fiction and even in historical fiction isn't really that much different to speculation in fantasy. It's just under a different brand. Sometimes I find that fantasy is speculation of the past and science fiction is speculation of the future, but both can have supernatural speculation in their respective genres. Is there an alternative then? Can there be fantasy or even mildly speculative stories that aren't based on witchcraft, paganism, and mythology, but are still very compelling stories? I would argue yes. And I'd like to talk about a particular kind of fantasy that I would love to see more of in modern writers' culture. So far, I haven't seen anyone else use a term to describe it. I've done some research. I've tried to see if this genre exists already. If it does, it's very rare, and I haven't heard of a major case where I could give you an example to show you off the top of my head of an example of this genre. If you have heard of someone or a group who has explored it, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. But I'm calling what I'm looking for skill-based fantasy. I have a list of some different types of it that I want to show at the end of the video, so if you want to see that, you can stick around to the end. But instead of speculation of the supernatural fantasy, this kind of fantasy would be based on the mastery and maybe even a little bit of artistic speculation of real skills that people do around the world. Like real, genuine, concentrated skills. And I don't just mean sci-fi technology, I mean practical skills like animal husbandry, sword mastery, leadership, leatherwork, textiles, culinary arts, human services, theological studies, artistry, law, relationships, any science. I mean, the list could go on almost indefinitely. You could have characters, groups, or even kingdoms that specialize in these different skills that people do. A lot of the encounters that the story would be centered around would be around the mastery and the wonder of experiencing and practicing these skills rather than encountering some kind of new supernatural thing that the audience or the character has not yet experienced before. Not only would this kind of storytelling encourage people to explore the skills that they enjoy, but it's also really wholesome and inspiring. I would say as a Christian that it's even part of exploring the dominion mandate given to Adam and Eve in Genesis, that we as humans are supposed to be taking healthy dominion of God's creation and exploring what He has made and what He has given us to do on the earth. Instead of just saying, what if there was this supernatural thing in a story? We could be saying, what if there was this skill that was used to some of its fullest potential? And as a Christian, I could ask, what if a certain skill was used to its fullest potential in the Lord and through the power of the gospel? See, one of the things about magic and mythological world building condoned in a fantasy story is that many times magic seems like cheating. So instead of having a character who is, say, good at using fire in a story, a magic-based story will have a firebender or a fire elf or a spirit or a god of fire. The character could literally just make fire with their fingertips, or breathe fire out of their mouths, or practice some kind of fire magic. It takes away a lot of the practical effort of becoming a safe master of something like fire that can be both dangerous and necessary. Instead, it just makes it some plasticine, manipulatable force that bows to the character's will. Instead of a regular human learning something like good stewardship over fire, the story just reduces fire to something that's instantaneously created and mastered in the palm of one's hand. Even in stories where characters have to work hard to get their magic, the magic itself is usually some kind of hack. It's usually an easier method of getting some kind of skill or experiencing some kind of supernatural power that appears to be within the character's control. Instead of in Christianity, where we can experience healthy supernatural relationship in God through the death and resurrection of Jesus, magic is experiencing the supernatural on our own terms, by our own desires, under our own will. It's cheating, it's counterfeit glory. Many times it's doing the supernatural with our own efforts instead of experiencing the glory of God on His terms. Instead of exploring creation from a Christian perspective, sort of like astronomer Johannes Kepler said when he was talking about thinking God's thoughts after him, magic in stories is often a way of exploring creation and exploring the supernatural the quick and easy way. But if you have a story where skill is celebrated, you're able to appreciate the effort and the generational talent that went into creating or doing those things. Kind of like when we watch videos on YouTube or on any other platform, where you watch some skilled master at something. You could tell they've done it countless times. And we love watching someone use their skill to make something that is very excellent. They're just flexing as they create their creations. Or kind of like when people enjoy watching the Olympics, they're watching top-notch athletes do skills that most people can't do, and you can tell that there's been dedication and talent and effort and sacrifice and sweat that has gone into becoming some of the best at the particular skills and athletic feats that they're doing. You can appreciate the fruits of their labor because you know how much dedication and effort went into it. To me, magic tends to rob a story of that kind of depth. It tends to rob our experience of the supernatural and of taking care of the earth by doing it outside of and often even against God. It's doing the supernatural outside of relationship with God. It tends to rob us of the human experience by giving us this cheap, quick way to get skills and fruit that honestly is better when it is time-tested and done with patience and effort and sacrifice. Instead, it gives us this cheap, instant power that's airbrushed and perfect and requires so much less effort than a real skill does in real life. I want to note here that I'm not completely against all magic in stories. If evildoers and bad guys and antagonists in a story do witchcraft and paganism and sorcery outside of God because they practice all other kinds of evil too, this can make sense to me in a story, especially if it's proving a spiritual point. This stuff happens in real life. People really do practice witchcraft, magic, and paganism in real life, and it does need to be addressed by Christians, even in storytelling. What I do have trouble with is a story that has magic as part of its world building, and fantasy world building magic that is integrated into the fabric of the tale. Usually both good guys and bad guys are practicing some form of the magic, and it's very speculative many times, and usually is condoning any kind of spirituality that's not in the Word. So, based on what I just described as skill-based fantasy, it's not based on magical world building or mythological themes. Let's imagine that example I gave in the beginning of the video about the rival kingdoms in that fantasy story, or the main character that wants to bring peace through some kind of skill or relationship or friendship-based method. And right away, we suddenly have a really compelling, interesting, entertaining fantasy story that requires no magic in its world building and no condoning of witchcraft or paganism in order to be a good tale. It can be informative and entertaining and exciting, spiritually enriching, inspiring. It could have lessons and themes. It can explore what happens when people do right and what happens when people do wrong. It can be godly, it can be blatantly Christian and Christ-like, but all still be fantasy. I see huge discipleship and evangelistic potential in this kind of storytelling. It can be thoroughly Christian instead of being spiritually vague or worse, spiritually wrong, and still be an epic story. So if you're an author or filmmaker, especially a Christian one, and you're out of ideas for storytelling, this video might be for you. I'm looking for skill-based fantasy, and it's very hard to find. I encourage you to start filling in this gap. Let us know in the comments if you're the kind of reader who would also be interested in this kind of storytelling. I see a great need for God-centric, kingdom of heaven-based stories, celebrating good things like the skills God gave us to work His glory in the earth. If you know of any other books or movies or shows out there that are skill-based fantasy, as long as they're clean and spice-free, let us know in the comments so that we can look into them, because I'm interested, and I'm sure there's other people interested as well out there. I myself am an unpublished author as of the making of this video, but I do write, and I'm working on some projects that I'm looking forward to sharing in the future if the Lord wills. It'll be definitely down the road. I don't have release dates or finished projects yet, but I'd love to hear your feedback on the kinds of skill-based fantasy you might be interested in as an audience, especially a Christian audience. So in a bit, I'm going to put on the screen a list of some of the genres that I have been working on under the big genre of skill-based fantasy. And some of the projects are a blend of the different kinds. Some of them are more focused on one. The first kind of skill-based fantasy that I've worked with and want to work with more in the future is kingdom fantasy, where the focus is on relationships between different people and the different crowns of different lands. A second type is children's fantasy, where the main characters are kids and young people. I have worked on a project or two like this, and children's stories are just such a joy to write and to be around. A third one is action fantasy, where the plot is high-paced, might have mystery elements and problem-solving components, and has lots of movement and is very dynamic. The fourth would be adventure or journey or quest fantasy, sort of like maybe Lord of the Rings, but without condoning the magic and mythology commonly found in Lord of the Rings styled stories. I would place a sea-themed or sort of that pirate swashbuckling type of story in this category as well. And then lastly, of the categories that I've worked on and been interested in working on, is some kind of romantasy. Now, my style of romance is very rarely ooey gooey, but I think there's a need for Christian romance stories, and especially Christian fantasy, because there's a lot of Christian romance already out there. So Christian romantasy, more like, that isn't based on a woman falling in love with some kind of mythological supernatural being. Or a sort of possessed by darkness human, common in some romantasy as well. If I would write romantasy, I'd like to do it clean or at least healthy from a Christian and biblical perspective, and then set in skill-based fantasy with humans falling in love, not mythological creatures and humans or elves or fae or something like that. So let me know of these types of fantasy which you would be most interested in as an audience. And it's okay if it's more than one, and I might still write and work on some of the projects that aren't as popular just because I enjoy them. I also might be missing some types here, so let me know if I did miss some that you would be interested in. Obviously, I haven't mentioned sci-fi. I'm not opposed to writing sci-fi, it's just not necessarily my type, as I mentioned earlier, and I don't think I'm as skilled at it as fantasy type writing. I will say though, some of my current fantasy projects definitely have an element of technology to them. It's not really steampunk, it's just fantasy with some technology. It's in the background, and it just ends up often being complementary to many of the skills that the characters are doing. It just gets to the point where some of the skills in stories need to be explained with technology rather than explaining them with magic. I don't mind tech, I just don't love the tech saturation of science fiction. So some of my fantasy stories, even some of my kingdom fantasy stories, definitely have elements of technology. It's just in the background, it's not super strong, and it's supplementary to the fantasy land, the lore, and the skills that the people are using in the plot. Another genre I didn't mention here was allegory or parable. This one actually got me into hardcore writing in high school. And parables and allegories are some of my personal favorite types of stories in my Christian story consumption. But I don't usually lump allegories into traditional fantasy. They're just not speculative enough to me to be traditional fantasy. Some allegories and parables definitely have fantasy elements, but they're just not in the same overall category as fantasy itself. Also, there are some relatively good Christian allegories already out there, so the need for them is not as great to me as skill-based fantasy. I do want to publish some of my allegory projects in the future though, so let me know if you're interested in that as well. So the categories I listed above were kingdom, children's, adventure, action, and romantasy. And then on the side, sci-fi and allegory. So let me know in the comments if you're interested in any of these, or if I missed some that you also would be interested in. And if you're an author yourself, I am highly encouraging you to explore the genre of skill-based fantasy. And until next time, from Diamond Quill Press, God bless.